Welcome back. We are continuing our discussion on variable scope and function scope inside of JavaScript. In the last lessons, we have shown how we can avoid putting things in global scope by either using self-executing anonymous functions or the revealing module pattern. So our vendor JavaScript is working just fine. This cool open source library we were creating is working just fine. But our internal app.js is not. We're not being good stewards. We have this global variable, and then we have another global variable. Both of these live in the global space, and we don't want that. So let's fix it. The easiest way to fix it is by simply putting the var keyword on there. That's exactly what we need to do. But let's get some help from JavaScript itself. We're going to use strict. Now, by using that use strict in these patterns, it lets JavaScript throw a runtime error because we have an undefined variable. You notice it says variable undefined in strict mode. So in strict mode, by us putting use strict at the top of our function, it's telling JavaScript, hey, don't assume these are global variables. Throw an exception. Throw an error because this needs to be defined and it's not been defined, and don't you dare put it in the global object space. So again, to correct it, all we have to do is wrap some vars in there, and in theory that would correct it. Now we're going to have a different problem now when we run it. Is use strict is not going to give us a problem, but now we're going to get another global variable is undefined. Okay, and that's because we are treating this as a global variable here, right? So I can't just put the var keyword on there. Instead, I need to copy this variable name, come up here, and declare it at the top. So you can declare a variable and not assign it a value, right? So we can simply say another global variable up here, and now when we run this, everything's going to load up and work just like it needs to. Okay? So by us moving another global variable up here, what happens is when my function gets created, it says, okay, well, this is another global variable, and these are bad names. So really what we need to just do is just call these, about just variable and another variable. Okay. And I'll rename them down here as well. And so we see everything's still working as we expect. All right, they're no longer global, so I just wanted to rename them. Obviously, you can name variables anything, as long as it doesn't start with a number, as long as it starts with a letter. And again, there's a couple, as we discussed in the very first lesson, there's a couple special characters, like a string or an underscore. But for the most part, people typically avoid those. There is a library there called jQuery that uses the $sign. There's other libraries that use it as well. Some folks, when they are working with jQuery, they'll actually use a $sign in front of the variable name to signify that it's a jQuery object. But again, we might discuss that when we talk about jQuery. Variables can be named anything. I simply wanted to get rid of the global from the variable name since they were no longer global. So let's recap one last time, since this is a very important subject, how we're able to use two different patterns, and we can pick one. And you typically want to pick one, whichever one you like the most, and stick with it. If you ever do any sort of development using HTML and JavaScript for Windows Store apps, They use both patterns, but the most common pattern, especially in the Win.js library, is the object literal notation, is returning an object literal. So this may be a good pattern to get down. It just depends on if you prefer to do a return and explicitly call out what you're returning, or if you would rather prefix what you're returning with the global variable we're setting up here. So again, in this scenario, get page isn't exposed directly, but calculate page is. And just to run through this one more time, our anonymous function has two parameters. The second parameter doesn't get passed in, which makes sure that if we're using undefined, then it truly is the real JavaScript undefined and not what somebody else may have set. And we can actually add this to our other pattern by simply typing in undefined up here. Again, because we're passing in as, we're expecting this as a parameter, but we're not actually passing it in. So when this happens, undefined will actually truly get the JavaScript undefined. And to explain one last time exactly what this piece of code is doing, it would be identical to saying if window.vendor ABC is equal to undefined. So I want to set window.vendor ABC to a new object. That's what that shorthand is really doing. But it allows us to write it one time here instead of anywhere else. One last benefit I'll talk about here. Right now, the assumption is we're using, kind of a single JavaScript file, app.js, for example. So let's go over here to app.js. And we have the same scenario here, window.app, window.app, okay? What if we had another JavaScript file called, page2, for lack of a better word, page2.js. We could copy this pattern over here to page2, okay, and we'll just clear out all the actual internal bits. And so inside of here, I'd want to say something like app.cool function. And so perhaps this page 2, has app.cool function that does some stuff, does cool stuff. But back in our actual app.js, let's say we had something else where we said app.some function equal function do something here. One of these script files is going to get loaded before the other. So let's say app gets loaded first. It's going to come in, it's going to do all this stuff. It's going to check the app variable. It says, does that exist? It does not exist, right? So it can't set it to itself because that's undefined. So it's going to set it to a new object. Okay. So it says, first time I come in here, app is a brand new blank object. And then when it gets all said and done, it adds this function called some function to that object. So at any point, once this script loads, somebody could call app.some function, okay? And that would be valid. Now, after this script loads, let's say page 2 loads. So when page 2 loads, it says, hey, is window app undefined? It's not undefined. It exists, and it currently has a function called some function. So now, this is going to get passed in to app. And so app currently has some function, and then we're adding to the object a whole new function called cool function. So by the time this script's done, so once both scripts are done, somebody should be able to call cool function and sum function. Both will be present inside this app because we're not overriding it. And this can be really beneficial when you're trying to split large JavaScript files up into multiple files, or you're trying to organize them in a certain way by passing it in this way. This is a very beneficial way to do that. Okay, let me delete these. So this will wrap up our discussion on scope, the revealing module pattern, the self-executing anonymous functions, and how we can use strict so we can be made aware if we forget to use the var keyword.